Undertale is an influential game to say the least. You can't really go anywhere on the internet without seeing sans or hearing the soundtrack. And there have been many videos, including a great one by Super Eyepatch Wolf, made about its impact over the wider internet. But there are also parts of the central game that are still shrouded in mystery. Toby Fox did a great job hiding lore in every part of the game, and the beauty of it is that we will probably never really know the full story. Some of the cleverly simple systems, like the Fun Valley, were really only the first curtain to pull back in the quest to understand this outstanding tale. And I don't really have anything better to do, so here's a little massive analysis. Beyond its influence, Undertale really was a great game. One Dog and a Timmy put together not only one of the best indie games of all time, but arguably the best Kickstarter success story ever. I already covered one indie Earthbound-inspired Kickstarter-funded indie game, so it's time to buckle down and take on Undertale. But anyways, what is this video? Well, it's a few different things thrown together. I wanted to make a video over Undertale, but I also wanted to make sure to cover different things that most videos over Undertale haven't really covered, which is very similar to the approach I took with my Amori video. And I'm going to split up the video into a few different parts, and of course the first part is going to be a character analysis, because those are great. After that, I'll get into the depths of the lore and why it still hasn't been solved and why it likely will never be. This also includes time for theories, and then I'll just go over a few other things like its influence and soundtrack and we'll be done. Sounds simple enough? Cool. Let's go. Oh yeah, obviously complete spoilers for Undertale, but you were probably already spoiled for every route approximately 3 months before the game was even released, so whatever. Also be sure to subscribe if you want even more of these long form video essays. I already did one over the game Amori, so if you like this one, be sure to also check that one out. If you look at it objectively, then Undertale is kind of a messy game. The aspect ratio is weird, the art style is strange, and the actual plot of the game is kind of all over the place. But the thing really holding it all together is the characters. Each and every boss is a memorable part of the game, totally defining the respective parts of the game, and each highlighting the tragedy of being trapped in the underground really is. These bosses all have somewhat good intentions and end up pitting them against the player during the course of the game. Their strengths and flaws twist together to create startlingly complex characters for a game about silly font skeletons. And their arduous struggles really do make you begin to wonder if leaving the underground is really worth crushing all their hopes and dreams. Upon entering the world of Undertale, the first friendly face that you see that doesn't turn out to be a soulless flower is Toriel. As her name suggests, she is the tutorial for Undertale. She patiently guides the player through the ruins, and she is the only real company during this section of the game. But she doesn't want the player to go into the further underground, so she tries to stop you. Upon Toriel's chest, you can see the famous Delta Rune, and I believe that is a good place to start. The Delta Rune appears all throughout Undertale. In fact, by the time you encounter Toriel, you've already seen it once in the introduction sequence. The Delta Rune actually symbolizes the prophecy that is at the center of Undertale, an angel from the surface, which is symbolized by the winged circle at the top, will go into the underground and depopulate it of monsters. This could of course mean two different things. Either the angel frees all the monsters in the underground, or they slaughter them. Put simply, this is the all-encompassing symbol of the hope of the inhabitants of the underground. And of course, Frisk becomes this angel, but it's up to the player's choice if that angel brings freedom or death. Toriel may wear this rune across her chest, but honestly she doesn't seem to exhibit much hope for ever escaping to the surface. It's likely that she gave up on that ideal after seeing what Asgore was willing to do to obtain it. Nevertheless, just like all the characters, Toriel does have ambition and dreams, even if they don't really necessitate her reaching the surface. We see that she plans on becoming a teacher, and in the neutral and true routes she does achieve this dream. And what's probably a joke about tutorials being too hand-holding, Toriel coddles the player at the beginning of the game. She does several of the puzzles for you and tries to direct the player towards the safest paths, but through this her controlling character begins to seep in. Toriel is not perfect. She takes in a child who at no point asks her to, and then just decides to force said child to stay with her. Her coddling becomes controlling, and the player is forced to fight her in order to escape. Well, not really fight, more like just stare at her menacingly, while making peace signs and avoiding all of her fire attacks. I believe that Toriel is someone with very strong and concrete morals that she attempts to hold herself and others to, despite it being stated that Toriel and Asgore had extremely strong marriage and were very close. When Asgore violated her morals by declaring war on the humans, she cut herself off from him. Despite her loneliness, she stays isolated in the rooms to fulfill what she believes to be her duty, protecting any children which fall down. Although she outwardly states that keeping Frisk in the ruins is for their own safety, it's also pretty clear that Toriel is lonely in the ruins. She seems to keep herself in a sort of self-enforced isolation, but she still communicates with the outside world killed some. One monster in particular, and her relationship with said monster becomes incredibly important in the genocide route. Toriel makes Sans promise to protect any humans that come from the ruins. Ultimately, I do think this is more important for Sans as a character, so I'll get to it later. But in her loneliness, telling jokes to a stranger through a door becomes the most interaction she gets with anybody. That is, until you drop in. Let me rephrase something. I said earlier that Toriel doesn't exhibit much hope in the prophecy of the Deltarune, but she ends up placing her hopes in the Angel of the Prophecy, just in a very different way. When Frisk falls down, it's like the answer to all of her problems just fell out of the sky. Now she has somebody to keep her company, and it's a child that she can raise and teach, fulfilling her dream of teaching and maybe even helping to fill the hole that losing Azrael and Chara created. But you, the player, already know that there is more for you outside the runes, so you push past her, leaving her behind and beginning your trek for the underground. Back when I first played through Undertale, Papyrus was my favorite, but looking back now, yeah, he still is. Younger me had fire taste. Papyrus is egotistical, incompetent, and has a loud annoying laugh. Reminds me of something. But unlike a certain obnoxious person, Papyrus genuinely cares. He obviously does not want to hurt the human, even though he knows that doing so would probably get in his dream position of Royal Guard. Papyrus's boastful attitude does not stem from an internal superiority complex or anything. He just does everything with 100% effort. Whenever something goes wrong, he just keeps going, and in order to keep himself motivated in spite of his constant failure, he constantly builds himself up and reaffirms his gloriousness. Just like many other monsters, Papyrus assumes that the angel from the prophecy of the Deltarune is Asgore, and he sees Asgore's collecting of the human souls as a way out of the underground. So naturally, he pushes himself to try to join this Royal Guard and become part of that beacon of hope. Actually capturing a human for Asgore would get him both of his dreams. He would instantly become part of the Royal Guard and the barrier would finally be lifted. So when Frisk walks into his life, he doesn't notice, because Frisk was standing behind a very conveniently shaped lamp. Sans is initially introduced as a complete foil for his font brother. Sans is laid back and does not take his job of looking for humans very seriously. He seems more or less content where he's at, while Papyrus is grasping for higher highs. Their relationship reflects the conflict that this constantly generates. Sans slacks off, Papyrus's very high effort attempt fails, and then Sans makes a bad pun. But of course Sans knows just a bit more than he initially lets on. Despite constantly building himself up, Papyrus's relationship with most other characters is one of constant admiration. Obviously, he admires Asgore, but also Undyne for being the head Royal Guard. He also admires Mettaton so much that he said he'd be willing to move to Hotland just to be where he is. If you befriend him, he mentions that you are extremely cool as well, and I expect that he would have quite a bit of respect for somebody like Alphys, the Royal Scientist, or Toriel, the Queen. Although seeing the Royal Guard as a beacon of hope might be a part of why he wants to join it, it's pretty clear what his main motivation is. He wants to finally have friends and be popular, and obviously joining the Royal Guard is the only possible way this could happen. The people of Snowdin are pretty cold to him compared to his brother, and his mailbox is permanently empty, but he still does have friends. His friendship with Undyne is one of the most prominent in the entire game. But it's a lot more likely that he's just endlessly chasing after becoming popular as some form of idealistic pursuit, convincing himself that if he just gets this position of Royal Guard, then all of his problems will go away and he'll just live happily ever after. He just has to capture a human, then he will finally get all the things he utterly deserves. Head of the Royal Guard, Undyne can be a little bit intimidating, but she's just a bit intense, right? If Undyne and Papyrus have one thing in common, it's that they put their all into everything they do. It's just that Undyne's all is quite a lot. She is easily the most determined monster in the game who completely refuses to die, and with the effects that determination has on monsters that I'll get to later on in this video, that has interesting implications. Undyne is a wholehearted believer in hard work and values strength over just about everything else. She never holds back, but is also fair and respects her adversaries. She's sure to explain green mode to the player whenever she places them in it, and in her training of Asgore, Asgore was sure to teach her the value of pacifism as well, and she comes to respect people like Alphys and Frisk on the pacifist route and their refusal to fight. Like most characters, Undyne is a firm believer in Asgore's plan to collect the final human soul and break the barrier, but while she initially tries to hunt down this human that she sees as dangerous, if you befriend her, she doesn't hesitate to turn around to defend you from Asgore. She doesn't seem to be one to wistfully wish for a better future though, and out of all the characters, she seems to be one of the most content with her life underground. She helpfully mentors Papyrus and Shyren, but she admits that she never plans on admitting the former to the Royal Guard. It's not just because she thinks he's incompetent, it's just that she feels that he's too nice to fight. She tries to steer him towards cooking, but he's not great at that to say the least. At the garbage dump, Undyne and Alphys first meet. Despite their very different personalities, they became close friends very quickly. Alphys introduced her to anime, but she told her that they were really human biopics, which is easily one of the best running jokes. Despite her usual brave and straightforward personality, Undyne ends up having a lot of trouble admitting her feelings to Alphys. She repeatedly writes letters and then goes to deliver them before doubling back to rewrite them. She really does admire Alphys for her intelligence and drive whenever it comes to science. And though Undyne might initially come off as just hard-headed and rude, she is shown to be a genuinely kind and thoughtful person. But whenever the player chooses to do a genocide route, she doesn't hold back. In fact, Undyne the Undying is the first real obstacle that you face in a genocide route that isn't just the boredom of walking around in circles to grind. Undyne refuses to bow down to fate and stops at nothing to stop this angel of destruction. But in the end, despite how her soul overflows with determination, she can't stop a true monster like you. Alphys lives in quite the contrast to most of the other characters in the game. Papyrus and Undyne are both loud and boisterous, but Alphys is shy, nervous, and insecure. To be completely honest, Alphys was always my least favorite out of the group, but she is still a pretty interesting character worth analyzing. It's kind of funny that she's my least favorite, as she is exceptionally similar to Basil and Omori in more ways than one. Growing up, Alphys lived on the same street as Bratty and Caddy, and they mentioned that she was a bit like an older sister to them. Alphys was always interested in human stuff and would often go on trips to the garbage dump to look for cool stuff, and Bratty and Caddy would come with her. This interest in humans led her to joining a human fan club that was created by the ghost Metaton. She became friends with Metaton and made a body for him, but to impress Asgore, who she apparently had a crush on, she claimed that she had actually created a soul for the Metaton robot instead of just putting a ghost inside it. And Asgore is so impressed by that, and probably very excited at the prospect of possibly getting the final human soul without having to kill any more children, so he appoints Alphys as head scientist. Alphys' character, while still hopeful for the possibility of escaping to the surface, is less defined by that hope and more defined by fear. She fears that after learning the truth about her, the people around her would dislike her, shame her, and ultimately leave her. With Metaton, she is afraid of him leaving her when he doesn't need her anymore, so she constantly stalls in the creation of his final body in an attempt to keep him reliant on her. She desperately wants Frisk to like her and also wants to become a hero in their eyes, so she sets up puzzles and traps around Hotland and tells Metaton to harass Frisk so that she can be a hero and save Frisk. She doesn't want you to see the real her, so she creates a facade that she thinks will make you like her, and also maybe stop you from killing Asgore in order to escape the underground. Alphys constantly presents herself in her interests in slightly skewed lights in order to attempt to impress Undyne and make her think that she's smart. She tries to make anime sound more important and is afraid of Undyne finding out about her feelings about her because she doesn't want her to think that she's just a nerdy loser. But of course, the thing she hides the most, and what brings her constant guilt and insecurity in her work, is her big mistake. When she experimented with determination and accidentally created the amalgamates, she hid what happened from everyone. She had tried to save the lives of fallen down monsters and possibly free everyone from their underground prison, but in the process of doing so, she created pitiable abominations. She of course fears Asgore discovering this the most, as then the king would see her failure, and see what she truly was. But through the actions that you take as Frisk, you can really help her out. Though she says that helping you made her feel better about herself, I think that putting on that charade, and then coming clean really taught her that her true friends would just accept her for who she was, and they probably already know more about her than they're letting on. She confesses to Undyne and also tells everyone about the true lab, and while she does get fired, at least the amalgamites finally get to go back to their families. In the genocide route, things are unsurprisingly not as sunny. Though she doesn't appear in the normal genocide route, if you just kill Undyne and Metaton, it's said that Alphys is nowhere to be found, and it's implied that she committed suicide. Ultimately though, Alphys is a character who largely depends on the people around them to survive, but she also has a hard time showing her true self to them. Metaton is a talk show host robot turned human murderer robot. He is self-obsessed and also hates humans. Also, he has an artificial soul created by the genius Dr. Alphys herself. Also, those are all lies. Well, except for the self-obsessed part. Metaton was originally a ghost and the cousin of Nastablook. He worked at their snail farm and promised to never leave him behind. But when Alphys created a body for him and he began his rise to stardom, he kinda forgot about that. Though it seems to be implied that he was much nicer before he got his body, immediately after receiving it, he began to belittle Alphys and her interest. And despite this, he was still in debt for the whole bodybuilding thing. So when Alphys asked him to play a character of a genocidal robot for her to thwart, then he goes along with it. Despite being shallow and fame obsessed, he isn't really evil. He is one of the few monsters that doesn't harbor a hatred for humankind. Along with Alphys, he is fascinated by their culture and tries to emulate a lot of human stuff in his various shows and performances. But at the various endings of the game, it's shown that Mettaton cares a bit more than he initially shows. In some of the neutral endings where he killed characters like Undyne, Mettaton is shown to regret being so terrible to her when they can't find her anywhere. And in the true pacifist ending, Mettaton finally reunites with Master Blook and takes him on his tour. Ultimately, Mettaton is not really a complicated character in comparison to some of the others, but I do really like his boss fight music. Asgore, the kindly gardening goat king of the underground. He enjoys golden flower tea and murders human children. The build-up to Asgore is really well done in my opinion. I love how you are given two conflicting images of him throughout the game. At first, Toriel warns you that he will kill you if you leave the runes, but characters like Papyrus, Undyne, and Alphys sing his praises and make him out to be a kindly person and a strong ruler. Whenever you finally find him, you pretty much find out that it's all true. He's a peaceful old goat who talks with Western slang for some reason, but because he wants to free the monsters, he forces himself to kill any humans that fall down into the underground. When the fight with Asgore begins, he destroys the mercy button, and this is interesting as it not only makes the fight different from every other one in the pacifist route by forcing you to fight and actually use your weapons, but also communicates that Asgore believes that he doesn't deserve your mercy. He's done terrible things, and should you get the chance, he believes that you should show him no mercy in killing him. While the other monsters of the underground are focused on hope, Asgore is that hope for many. In order to give the monsters of the underground some semblance of hope for the future, he declared war on the humans and sought to break the barrier with the 7 human souls. But he didn't actually want to do this, and this is most evident in the fact that he didn't just pass through the barrier once he had obtained 1 soul, but instead chose to wait and just hope that more humans wouldn't fall down. That way he wouldn't be forced to kill anymore. He maintained the hope for everybody, but he didn't ever take action and free everybody, because he didn't have the strength to do it. In the past, Asgore and Toriel were inseparable. They had a very close marriage and were apparently insufferable together. But after Kara and Azrael died, which prompted Asgore to declare war on humans, Toriel left him permanently and took up residence in the ruins, and they both seem to miss each other, even if Asgore is the only one to reveal it. He now constantly gardens, and he's tried to create Toriel's butterscotch pie recipe to no avail. On the flip side, Toriel is always making her pies, but there seem to not be many flowers in her house, outside of the golden flowers which are everywhere in the game. Despite all the things he's done, Asgore has been nothing but a positive influence for most of the characters in the game. He trained Undyne from the time that she was a child, and eventually made her the head of the Royal Guard. He also seems to try to use his position as king to make the underground a better place, as he seems to be at least attempting to pass regulation to make some of the puzzles and traps set up by Papyrus a little bit less dangerous. Of course, Papyrus isn't really listening. Asgore is incomplete without his family. Without Toriel, Azrael, and Kara, he seemed to lose all meaning. After losing his children, he began to look for purpose and hope in other things, and he eventually decided that he would find a purpose in becoming that hope for all the inhabitants of the underground. He decided to use his power as king to become a beacon, even if it tore himself and what remained of his family apart. But he never really wanted to fulfill that hope that he created. He purposely didn't go out and collect the rest of the souls because he didn't want to kill. He was content just gardening and being a symbol of hope for all. Because Asgore is the boss monster, he cannot age until his children become older and then replace him. But because his only son Azrael died, he will never age. Asgore is cursed to stay the same age forever, and forever he will bear the weight of the curse that he put upon himself, the responsibility of completing the horrid task that he promised the entire underground he would do. Sans is obviously a massive meme, and by just glancing at him you can get a pretty good idea of why. He constantly makes puns, he talks using the font Comic Sans, and uses Patrick voice clips to his sound effect. He has a catchy song that just had to be put everywhere on the internet, and he breaks the fourth wall decently often. But his meme status isn't really a negative on his character, as he's pretty unique. His distinct change in attitude in the genocide route from a comic relief character with a little bit of a mysterious side to an insanely powerful fourth wall breaking character creates a fantastic in-game roadblock to make the genocide route all the more painful of a grind to complete. Sans is apathetic and lazy. He slacks on his job as a sentry, which annoys his brother to no end. But he's like this because he knows that everything he does makes really no difference in the grand scheme of things, because no matter what, eventually you will reset the timeline and all of his progress will be reset. He has a mysterious backstory that is hinted at in the game, and this is likely where all of his powers and the knowledge of the nature of the game really comes from. Sans views the protagonist as an anomaly. He sees that you are the one who is resetting the timeline again and again, and ends up trying to stop you by befriending you. He ultimately gets what he wants if you do a true pacifist run and then never resets afterwards. While he does state that he only doesn't kill you because of his promise to Toriel, I think that that's pretty unlikely. If he killed you, then you would probably be all the more likely to reset the timeline, which is just what he wanted you to stop doing. His behavior changes drastically depending on which route you're taking in the game. If you take the pacifist route, then he gradually begins to genuinely root for you and seems to consider you a friend. But in the genocide route, he mostly disappears until the end, but he insults you and warns you what will happen throughout the route if you keep moving forward with the genocide you're committing. One thing that people seem to forget is that Flowey is still Azrael. Sure, as a soulless Azrael, he can't feel any emotion and is kept together by pure determination, but it's still him. Azrael is still ultimately to blame for everything that he does as Flowey, and that really seems to get brushed over by a lot of people, originally including myself. But let's get back to basics. Azrael is a child of Asgore and Toriel and is very poorly named. As a child, he was calm and loving, and he developed a trusting sibling-like relationship with Kara, the fallen human. He even ignored the signs that Kara was not a great person and initially went along with their plans to free the monsters by going to the surface and killing 6 humans. But in the end, he changed his mind, and instead ended up absorbing the soul of Kara and going to the surface to try to find the golden flowers of their village by their request, where he was killed by the villagers. Much later, Alphys performs a determination experiment on a golden flower. It was the first one to bloom in the underground after Azrael's death, and though it initially didn't seem to do anything, Azrael eventually became reincarnated as Flowey within Asgore's garden. But without his soul, he could feel no joy, no love, and no compassion. Thanks to this determination, he has the power to control the timeline and save and reset as he pleases. And so that's what he does. And though he initially uses his powers to solve everything, he eventually got bored of returning to this save point and began to find people boring and predictable, like video game NPCs. So he did everything he could possibly think of. He kills everything. He does everything. And eventually he begins to see everything as just lines of dialogues and sets of numbers. But after Frisk appears, everything changes. Azrael, now Flowey, can't predict them and views them as an anomaly like Sans does. But he realizes that Frisk is more determined than him, and they now have the power to control the timeline. And eventually he comes to the conclusion that Frisk is actually Kara, who has come back to life through determination like him. In the true pacifist route, after he absorbs all the souls and finally returns to being Azrael and is defeated by the player, he finally realizes that the player isn't actually Kara, and he apologizes for what he has done. And at the very end of the game, you get to have a real conversation with him if you go back to the very start. In a genocide route, he never does realize that you aren't Kara. You show the same hatred for humanity that he saw in Kara, and so even as you murder him, he still believes that you are his best friend. Ultimately, Azrael is an interesting character. Initially, he only acted in an attempt to help people around him, and going through the barrier to bring Kara back to her village was for her sake. And he held back and allowed the villagers to kill him to spare their lives because he didn't want to kill them. But after losing his soul, he began to do terrible things. But it's kinda hard to blame him. We're pretty much led to believe that he was trapped in this loop of saving for pretty much eternity, unable to let himself die because of the determination to keep living that was injected into him. Of course, it reflects the player's actions in the game. Sure, the game may tell you not to reset everything after a pacifist route because that would force all the monsters back into the underground, but it's not real, it's just an inconsequential game, so it's fine if you reset it. And this is how Flowey eventually began viewing the real world. And the difference, of course, is that you are a real person and it is a fictional game. So you were right that killing fictional monsters isn't actually a morally bad thing, but it puts you into the same mindset as Flowey, which is very interesting. Azrael states that he adopted his killer be killed mindset after his choice to spare the humans on the surface resulted in his death, a decision that resulting in him being turned into a soulless flower. He believes that if he had killed the humans, then he would have not been subject to his terrible fate, but in the epilogue he takes it all back. Sparing those humans stopped a terrible war from happening, and paved the way for Frisk to free all the humans. Azrael may not have known it, but Frisk really was his only hope for a happy ending. As I still mostly want to stay out of theories and stuff here, I'll keep this brief. Kara is shown to be a pretty terrible person. People seem to believe that they weren't actually evil, but I don't really get why. If you want to discuss it in the comments, that would be cool. They have absolute hatred for humanity, and a real motivation for getting Azrael to follow her plan to free monsters was probably to escape and kill all humans. They tried to kill the humans who attack Azrael on the surface, and would have if he hadn't stopped them. You only really meet Kara in the genocide route, after fulfilling what they always wanted to do, and no matter if you want to or not, they erase the world, which shows that they may possibly have more power than you over the world by the end of the genocide route. On the surface, Undertale is a game about a world filled with goofy, likable characters, but most of these characters are unhappy with a fundamental part of their existence. While their individual plights differ, the source of most of their woes can easily be traced back to their underground prison, but they don't wallow around in misery. Each character is pulled forward by a hope at the center of their being, and I believe that this internal hope is the main thing of Undertale. And of course, the player's actions in the game are the difference between this dream coming true and annihilation. But don't get me wrong, Undertale isn't really a game that is secretly super dark and sad with just a bright exterior like Amori. Though its tone may darken in sections like the True Lab, it is mostly a bright, irreverent RPG just like Earthbound. It just has some more fourth wall breaking stuff. Undertale wears its nature on its sleeve, and that can be kind of grating at times. Don't get me wrong, the way it implements and twists your understanding of classic RPG tropes are certainly interesting and fun, but the fourth wall breaks get a little bit excessive at times. but that's not really a serious criticism, honestly. Toby Fox seemed to anticipate people being very interested into the more mysterious sides of Undertale, so he placed tons of little things within the game that hint at a deeper lore. The easily accessible parts of this lore, like Sans occasional mystique and seriousness, some weirder parts of the True Lab, and all the talk about timelines and souls, drove many people to dive a bit deeper. So they took the obvious next step and went within the code of Undertale, and there they found untold horror. First off, I'd just like to talk about the design behind how Toby hid the lore. There weren't really any super complicated systems or anything, he basically just had two methods to hide things. First off, the fun value. This one is really interesting. Each time you start up a game, a random number is generated in between 1 and 100. If that number lines up with a certain one, then you might experience different things during your playthrough. This makes different playthroughs unique and also makes it so that people would report strange things happening in the game early on and have almost nobody else know about them online. It's a super simple system that did a great job of adding to the mystery of Gaster because the vast majority of people wouldn't ever encounter him during their playthrough. Other than that, Toby made great use of hiding secrets in the files of Undertale, which really wasn't that super popular of a thing before, but now it feels like every indie game has it to some extent. Searching through the files and modding them became so popular that a tool was created just for it, the Undertale mod tool. And this tool is actually super useful as you can use it on any Game Maker Studio games to look at their files and rip things like sprites and songs. I used it years ago to get the sprites from Katana Zero for a video as well. Very shortly after Undertale released, a community sprung up around it. It was a huge hit after all, but while a lot of the community was focused on making fan art and like 500 fan songs for it, a decent amount was focused instead on exploring every single part of the game. On forums and subreddits, people dissected the game's mechanics, levels, files, and every bit of lore they could get around the mystery man. Though it ultimately didn't take too much time for every single bit of the game to be found, analyzing and theorizing about all these pieces became the community's next obsession. The amount of posts you can find on the internet about Undertale theories is absolutely insane. And speaking of these theories, okay, it's time for some theories. To be completely upfront, I don't have nearly as many of these as I had for Omori, simply because the lore of Undertale is a lot more difficult to theorize about than anything in Omori. There simply aren't that many hints, and you have to make some pretty big jumps and claims. But this is mostly based off this theory I found online that I thought was really good. It's really interesting and probably gets a decent amount of stuff right, but it's pretty much guaranteed to be mostly wrong, and I'll get to why I can pretty much guarantee that in just a bit. But if you want to check it out in the original wording and more specific detail, then there is a link to the description to this Reddit post that is connected to the original blog post, which I recommend reading if you're interested in this stuff. But it's time for a theory. A game theory. This theory is by Permanently Exhausted, and it starts with a simple assertion. The fun values show different intersecting timelines. Some of these timelines just have small differences, like a phone call from Alphys, but some have monsters that are from a different timeline, and one has the mystery man himself. Going back a bit, Gaster was doing a bit of experimentation. It was stated that Alphys' determination extraction machine was based on blueprints, and since this machine looks so similar to the Gaster Blaster, it can be theorized that this was originally designed by Gaster, and with it he discovered the power of determination. At this point in time, Gaster was still a brilliant scientist who Sans worked alongside, and they were both amazed at the essentially time-traveling powers of determination. Gaster decided to give himself enough determination to use the powers of saving and resetting, and also possibly gave Sans some, that way he could remember past timelines and continue to study with him. At first, Gaster just used his power to experiment, but eventually he became curious to the possibilities of killing people just like Flowey. Given infinite power and an eternity of time, it seems like almost anybody would eventually try killing if they thought that they could just skate around responsibilities for their actions. So Gaster progresses and eventually begins to do what are essentially genocide routes just like Flowey. But similar to Flowey, he always resets before fully reaching the void at the end of genocide, the void that we the player eventually reach. When Sans says stuff like he's seen your type before and also talks about XP, levels, and love, he knows what they mean, likely because he and Gaster created these terms in order to classify his genocide routes. But Gaster decides to finally follow through and destroy everything like we do in the genocide route. Gaster talks about a place with negative photon readings. Photons are lights, so saying that there are negative photons basically implies the existence of sort of like anti-light. Basically, a darkness darker than actual complete darkness. Where do we see these sorts of complete darknesses in the game? After the genocide route and right before Photoshop Flowey. The genocide route is in a timeline that has been completely destroyed, while the Flowey one is on a timeline that is on the brink of destruction. Gaster had likely reached that brink whenever writing entry 17, and so his next experiment was to finish it and completely destroy all its timelines like we do in the genocide route. But Sans knew that this complete destruction of all timelines could not be reset, so he somehow killed Gaster and shattered himself across all timelines, destroying what was left of the timelines they were in. So he shattered Gaster across the timeline timeline of his creation, just like his followers say. Sans Papyrus managed to escape to an intact timeline, which is the one that we are in, which is why people in Snowden say they just showed up out of nowhere and asserted themselves, because they were already in Snowden in this other timeline, so they are essentially just asserting themselves over what was essentially their home in a different timeline. Finally, the remnants of Gaster and his followers are leftovers from the destroyed timeline that sometimes appear depending on the specifics of the timeline that we enter, which is determined by the fun value. That probably ended up sounding a bit like the rantings of a crazed man. But you are watching an hour-long video over Undertale lore, so what did you really expect? Again, this theory was not created by me, and a link to the original theory by Permanently Exhausted is in the description, and it's a great read if you're into this kind of stuff. And you probably are, because, again, here you are. Now, as fun as theories like these are, they are probably nowhere close to the truth. But I believe that that is by design, and it is impossible to know for sure what really happened. Toby Fox decided to set up little tidbits of information and ultimately leave more questions than answers, which leads to a ton of theorism. This theorism led to the community around Undertale growing massively. Game theorist videos garnered millions and millions of views, and Gaster became almost like an internet creepypasta, although I personally don't really get how he's scary at all. You may be thinking, well, that sucks. It kind of seems like Toby Fox just set up a bunch of mysteries with no real answers and then called it a day, like The Force Awakens or something. And yeah, he pretty much did. But that's not really a bad thing in my opinion. Nobody would care about the mystery man if he wasn't a mystery anymore. And I think that Toby set out to manufacture something that nobody would really understand, and something that, even with extensive digging and theorizing, would never really be solved. I don't think that he'll answer the mystery of Gaster or Deltarune. He might leave more hints and explain some. I believe this mostly because you can't let the internet build up something for over half a decade and then have it not be a disappointment. I bet Toby realizes this, and though he may throw in a few more hints, there's no way I could see him really revealing the truth behind Gaster. I don't know, I could be wrong though. I kinda hope I am. Undertale is very famous for being a Kickstarter game, but even though it got 10 times what it was asking for with $50,000, that's still a pretty small amount of money to make a game with. Nevertheless, Toby pulled through and ended up with one of the best games ever. But the development of Undertale is quite the interesting story, as it really started looking almost completely different from how it eventually turned out. Toby started by creating the battle system. He wanted to create something unique and more interesting than a traditional RPG, and he also had the goal of utilizing the medium of video games to help tell a story, rather than just creating a story that could be told in books and movies. I mentioned before how much I like the style of storytelling in Omori. Video games are a very unique art medium. They still go unutilized very often in the stories that these games tell. But at this point in development, Undertale was still far from what it would become because it was missing a very important part: sparing. Toby says in the art book that he came up with the concept for the system because he didn't feel right killing Toriel at the end of the ruin section of the game. So he came up with the sparing system, and everything else just kind of fell into place. After more development, the game was put into Kickstarter in an attempt to gain more funding, and gain more funding it did, allowing Toby to massively expand the size and scope of the game and hire another artist, Timmy Chang. Toby would often write the music for sections before actually making them in the game, as it got him into the right mindset to make these sections. And after 32 months of development from start to finish, on September 15, 2015, the game was finally released. And I've talked a lot about Toby Fox. I definitely think he's one of the most interesting game developers out there. The Undertale art book is a great read and also gives great insight into his design and thought process when making the game. The one part of Undertale that I always hear universal praise for is his soundtrack, and yeah, it kinda slaps. But its art style seems to be a bit more controversial, especially the overworld. So I'm just going to look at and review the three main aspects of this art style. Those are the overworld sprites, battle sprites, and other sprites of the intro slideshow. The overworld sprites can be kinda ugly. Most obviously is Frisk, who is just plain ugly. But Toby has stated again and again, but Frisk was made like this on purpose, and I definitely agree that it fits the game well. Not only is Frisk's ugly, genderless mug a recognizable part of the game, but Frisk's lack of personality makes it so that they don't distract from the monsters and also helps the player to fit in their shoes. But Undertale is not an ugly game, and there are several very good looking parts of the overworld, like the core, a waterfall, parts of Snowden and Hotland, and more. Each and every part seems unique and memorable, and the NPCs look fine too. But the battle sprites are where the monsters get a bit more expressive. Now, I kinda wish that they were in color like they are in Deltarune, as Deltarune just straight up looks better. But Deltarune was built off the back of Undertale, so comparing the two isn't really all that fair. Monsters only have a few poses, but they all look good. But the game knows when to add a splash of color, or to mess with the battle scene, for a joke or to make a boss fight all the more interesting. The animations are limited, but I can't really hold it accountable for that, as it was mostly a budget and scope issue. Finally, I made this last section just to talk about the intro cinematic. The intro cinematic is so good, it was made by Timmy and is simple, pretty, and iconic. I love how it's actually a fake out and the fallen child we see in it is actually Kara, plus the extra frames with them and Azriel are great. Some people despise Photoshop Flowey and see it as edgy and cringy. I don't really get what's edgy about it, it mostly comes off as funny to me. It's a very hectic and cool, not very final boss for the game. And finally, the music. The music has so many leitmotifs that really tie everything together. There are great videos and a wiki article over all these motifs, but my favorites are the Once Upon a Time motif, the His Theme motif, and the Hopes and Dreams motifs. I'm no music critic, but I have listened to the soundtrack more than any other, so I'd totally give it a light 9 to a strong 10. Undertale's influence precedes the game by a large amount. Just about everyone in existence knows Megalovania and sans Undertale, but most haven't actually played the game, and so a lot of people end up judging it based on its annoying memes and obnoxious fanbase. This is unfortunate, but also unavoidable for any game that gets this big. When the game first released, it had a small following gathered from its Kickstarter release, but it wouldn't take long for it to begin to gather more traction. The game largely got popular off of famous YouTubers who played the game for an audience of millions, and a fanbase of people who made art, explored the files of the game, and just talked about it online began to grow. And it's not just like a handful of YouTubers cover this game. If you look back, basically every single video who was doing Let's Plays of games at the time covered Undertale. An unfortunate side effect of this was that literally everyone in existence was spoiled on the game. I mean, the most famous part of the game at this point is literally a secret twist boss in an alternate route. If Amori ever blows up like Undertale, I really hope that the internet treats it a bit more kindly. I don't really have much faith that it will, but the game is a lot less impactful if its signature twist spoiled. Outside the basic Let's Players, other YouTubers began to create content that actually had actual quality. Tons of fan-made songs and covers, animations, and of course theories. Game theory was really gaining traction during this time for their stupidly long FNAF series, so when they set their sights on the biggest indie game of the time, nothing could go wrong, right? Oh yeah. As far as war crimes go, this video is a pretty funny one. As the game became more and more popular, it started to be memed more and more. The amount of Undertale funny Vine moments that were created is absolutely soul-crushing statistic. But the memes really started to kick in when the game began to slip in relevance and everyone started getting sick of it. So now memes are just making fun of the overabundance of Undertale related stuff on the internet. Reminds me of something. As infamous as it is, the Undertale fandom has created some really cool things, so I'm going to talk about some of them. Obviously, there are lots of great pieces of fan art. There are also many great covers, but my favorites are the orchestral ones. The Undertale soundtrack just works so well in an orchestral format. I've never been the biggest fan of AUs, but the one that was kind of interesting for me was Disbelief's Papyrus, and there is a great fan-made boss fight for it. And of course, the big one, Glitchtale. If you haven't heard of it, Glitchtale is an animated series on YouTube made by Camellia Curtis, and it's quite epic to say the least. It's been in production for several years and is several hours long to boot. It's got fights, original music, and a storyline that is not complete garbage. Highly recommended. Wow, this Undertale fandom sounds pretty great. I wonder why it's so hated online. Yeah. There have been many videos over the less good parts of the fandom, and I'm mostly just going to acknowledge that they exist, and that a small minority of fans have become stereotypes for all fans, which sucks. Playing Undertale was a really unique experience for me. Up to then, I hadn't really ever played a game like it, and basically the entire year of 2016 was defined by this game for me. I played the game, listened to the music, and talked about it constantly with friends. In fact, I have Undertale to thank at least partially for me ever getting into game development. While my interest was mostly due to a game called Crashlands made by Butterscotch Shenanigans, seeing that both Crashlands and Undertale were made in GameMaker led me to starting to learn GameMaker, and my first game idea was basically just straight up an Undertale ripoff. And though I never got it off the ground, it got me thinking about game design and what I really wanted to work on. And, well, that's about it. Undertale is really a tale from the land down under. Thanks for watching all the way through, and sorry for talking so much about Amori and a video about Undertale. Be sure to subscribe for lots more long-form video essays as more are coming. I always take suggestions for videos and also discuss anything you want in the comments because that's like the most fun part of making a video for me. Bye.